Hi everyone, we're back. I have another series of encounters I'd like to share with you tonight. If you hear some noise in the background, that's rain on my roof. It's pouring down rain here, so just ignore it. Just like ignore my dog snoring. It's not a big deal. It's about the story. It's not about me, the rain, or the dogs. It's about the story. Okay, here we go. This first story is sent to me from Mickey. Mickey lives in Tennessee, and this is a great story. It's sometimes the mysterious type stories where people discover Bigfoot in a way that's not a direct confrontational encounter are very intriguing to me, and I love them, and that's what Mickey's story is. And so he writes, it was 2016 in the early fall in the Roosevelt Mountain region of Cumberland and Rowan County, Tennessee. We live here in a small community hidden in the mountains. One night, about dark, I had my dogs outside letting them run when my dad, who lives next door, called me. He told me that my pit bull had been hit by a car and took off into the woods. At the time, he had a large river cane patch next to his house and his garage. So we took off looking for Diesel, my pit bull. The hillside behind his house was very overgrown with brush and river cane. We were standing approximately 6 feet from each other looking up into the river cane and brush looking for Diesel, when suddenly a large rock weighing about 30 or 40 pounds flies and lands right between us. We never heard any knocks or grunts from any creature, and this was about the same time we stumbled upon something that has me convinced the Bigfoot must be part of the great ape family. We broke through the brush and thorns to find 2 large bedded down places overlooking a creek behind my dad's house and garage. My other dog, Gage, a 70-pound Catahoula cur, starts to raise in hell. Another rock is thrown in our direction coming from the woods near the creek. So we shined our lights and only saw a glimpse of something with rusty-colored hair, and we could only see a foot of it standing behind the creek bank. The creature was standing in the creek, and the bank was about 7 feet high, so whatever it was definitely very tall. But once we shined the lights in its direction, it took off running up the creek. You could hear all the rocks moving under its feet. We later found Diesel hiding in the thickest of the river cane, and for the rest of the few nights, Gage wouldn't leave mine or Diesel's side. It's almost like he knew something was out there. We have since cut down all the river cane and brush. It was too close for comfort being behind my dad's house so close. We no longer let our dogs run out at night without someone with them for fear that a large creature may return and attack the dogs. This was one of my encounters with what I believe to be a Bigfoot. I know it's not much, but I will carry it to my grave. And we had one that night throwing rocks at us and trying to get us away from their bed. Mickey, that's an extremely interesting encounter. It's like they're living so close to you. You know, I've heard they're drawn to water. And a lot of these guys who track Bigfoot or look for them, they'll go to water. Even if they're in the mountains, they'll stay in the valleys where the creeks run and stuff, looking for signs. And it sounds like you're right in a pathway where these things either move or live. So, and obviously they feel safe or non-threatened living there with a bedding area right above your house. It's pretty cool. And I thought that was a kind of a mysterious way to find a Bigfoot. Very good story. Thank you. The next encounter I have was sent by Kevin. The encounter actually happened in Atlanta, Georgia, when he was a little boy. You know, we get a lot of those encounters of people remembering back when they were children and seeing something they can't explain, and they later figure out that it was probably a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. Kevin writes, I grew up on the west side of Atlanta, Georgia, with my mom and my brother. In 1988, I was 6 years old, and we were living with my grandma near Hollywood Road. We would sometimes go to my mom's cousin's house, which was probably about 20 minutes up the road. We usually would go over there to have a cookout or just get away. I remember my mom's cousin always had strange stuff happening at our house. I remember it was winter time, and usually we would go play in the backyard or go down the street to the school and play in the playground. Normally, my mom wouldn't let me go because I was so young, but this day she didn't feel like going to school with me, and so she let me go with my brother and my cousin. At the time, my brother was 10 years old and my cousin was 11. We played on the playground for a little while, and my cousin said, "Let's go down to the hill and play on the leaves with the cardboard." Okay, I'm going to stop reading this story here. You know, us kids that grew up in the South, and this may not be limited to the South, but we don't get much snow down here. So sledding in the wintertime is like a freak of nature. It just doesn't happen. But if you take a fall day where it's been really dry and there's a ton of leaves on the ground, man, you can get a good big piece of cardboard and you can fly down a hill on a piece of cardboard. I remember we used to do that all the time. So, Kevin, thanks for mentioning that. I'm sorry to interrupt the story, but I wanted to inject that so people would know what the hell I'm talking about. Back to the story. My brother and cousin would sometimes do that, but this time I was with them. We started playing, sliding down the hill with the cardboard and having a blast. My brother would have to help me up the hill because it was so slippery and steep. After a little while, he and my cousin got annoyed because they had to keep helping me up the hill every time. It was around dusk time, and my brother went to the top of the hill because I was crying. He started yelling at me, "You can do it!" He finally came back down to help me, and I pushed him off of me. He said, "Well, if you're going to be that way, then I'm just going to leave you here." He went up to the hill with my cousin, and they left me there. I sat at the bottom of the hill and cried. I don't know how long I was crying or for how long I was there when all of a sudden I felt a big hand grab me. I thought it was my brother, but when I looked at his hand and all the way up his arm, I saw hair all over him. I was scared to death. I was too scared to look back at his face. All I could see was the hair on his arm and his feet. He grabbed me and held me by my stomach and carried me up that hill. When I got to the top of the hill, he let me go. I was too scared to look back, so I took off running. I ran back to the house, and my mom was in the kitchen. My brother and my cousin were playing Nintendo. I came in the house crying, and my mom ran upstairs and asked me what had happened. I told her that a big hairy man had put me up on the hill. My brother and my cousin came in the living room and said that it was probably a homeless man that lives in the woods that helped me. They were laughing at me, and my mom just kind of smiled at me. But to this day, I'm now 36. I could never forget that moment in my life. I guess it could have been the homeless guy in the woods, but my mind keeps going back to that day, and all I can remember is the brown and black, hairy foot and the hairy arms. And I believe it was something more. I have always been made fun of for telling this story and believing that there is something living in those woods. We went back to my cousin's house many other times, but I never went back to the woods because I was always scared that that big man with the hairy arms would want to get me. Kevin, man, that's one of those experiences that whatever it was, it's burned in your mind. You'll never forget it. I have had those experiences too, not with a Bigfoot or a homeless dude, but I mean, you know, you have things that happen to you and you never forget them. The images remain crystal clear with you the rest of your life. And so I think I know what you're talking about there. Those memories are just like engraved in your mind, where 99% of the other stuff that happens to you, you just forget it. So, man, thanks for sending that in. It was great. Appreciate you. This story was sent to me by John. It's another sledding story. Bigfoot must be attracted to kids sledding. But it's another story where it's a childhood encounter and a bunch of these kids are sledding and they have an encounter that's really scary. He writes, "I would like to share an encounter that happened to me when I was a boy. It was 1962 and I was 10 years old. It was December and plenty of snow was on the ground. We loved it when the snow began to fall because we could get out our sleds and make a run down the mountain. Earlier in that year, in the spring, we began to hear very unique sounds from the mountains around our house. Something was making sounds almost like a woman screaming, but it would trail off and not sound like a woman. Sometimes it was a horrifying scream or growl. There were 10 of us kids, 6 of which were boys. My sisters would be huddled together when those sounds would come from the mountain behind our house. One of the older men in our town called it the white thing. I would find out why in December. We would build a fire at the top of the sled run and use anything we could find to keep the fire going, and then we would ride our sleds down the hill and then walk back up. On that night, nearly everyone had gone home except me, one of my sisters, and another guy and his sister. There were 5 of us. We decided to go home and just let the fire burn out. We walked down the hill instead of riding our sleds. When we got to the bottom of the hill, we heard the loudest, ugliest growl that I had ever heard. It came from up at the fire. We turned to look, and standing there by that fire was a huge, hairy creature. It was looking at us. I don't really know how tall it was, but the fire was barely up to its waist. At that time, I had never heard of Bigfoot, but now I know what we saw. The other girl fainted, and her brother picked her up, and then we ran. When my sister and I got home, my dad was standing out on the front porch. He said, "Did y'all hear that thing scream? It sounded close." And we both said, "Yes, we saw it up at the fire, Dad." And Dad says, "That's the last time y'all will be up there after dark." But he didn't have to convince me because I had no intentions of being there after dark again. That next spring, a school friend told me that his dad shot it several times at almost point-blank range with a rifle when his dogs bayed it behind their house. His dad said it was growling and swiping at the dogs, and when he shot it, it turned and ran across the creek behind their house and straight up the mountain. I left my home state at 16 and haven't been back but about 3 more times. But there's still many stories from that state of Bigfoot activity. John, after having all that fun sledding, and then you look back up and there's a Bigfoot standing where you were. Man! And I can imagine hearing all those screams in an area where a bunch of y'all lived. That's just, these stories just keep coming, and they're great. They're just great stories, and they're packed with information if you listen. So anyway, okay, John, thanks. This story was sent to me by Robert. It didn't come with a title, but I'm going to give it a name. It's called Edgar the Bigfoot. Robert writes, "I'm 60 years old now, and my health is failing, so I figured I'd better tell this story before it's too late. And you seem to be the voice it deserves." Well, thank you, sir. I was born in Dallas and lived there until I was 10, but my father had bought a lake cabin on Possum Kingdom Lake when I was 4, so we spent most weekends there. Typically when we arrived, it was late on Friday night, and the first thing we did was open the cabin and let in fresh air, and then we would check the lake level on our boat dock out back of the house. The cabin had a small creek behind it when it rained, but it was dry if it didn't rain. Our dock was at the very end of a cove where the creek emptied into the lake. Then if we had time, we would check the front yard, which was mostly clay over layers of rock, and we could see very clearly deer tracks and raccoon tracks, but on a couple of visits there were tracks from a cougar that seemed to be chasing after a deer, and once there were human-like footprints that went up to the front door of the cabin. My dad always said it was just someone poking around and it was forgotten. Well, as I grew up there, I learned to track, and I could tell what most of the tracks were made by and what they were doing. As a kid, I had a BB gun and always went up into the hills just to get away from my folks. I had never heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch until the movie Boggy Creek came out. It was then I realized what I had been seeing, and when the internet came about, I found out more about their habits. But back to the beginning. I always had my backpack and had peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for my lunch. I built a small wooden fort along a trail I used most, and I would stop and eat there, hopefully safe from the big cat, which I did get a close-up and very personal look at, and it is burned into my brain until this day. I always got the creepy feeling I was being watched out there, but I never saw anything out of the normal. I did get a sniff of something dead mixed with wet dog a few times, but I just thought it was a dead deer or something. I didn't stay around to check. I heard whoops and whistles sometimes, but thought that was other people up in the cedar-covered hills. Well, one day at lunchtime, I went to my fort and sat down to eat thinking I was safe and alone. Boy, was I wrong. I became aware of someone walking towards my fort, and just as I realized I was trapped with only one way out, I saw the big man walk right up to the only opening and squat down in front of it. I looked at him, and he looked at me for a moment or so, and then he put his hand out and grunted at me. He was covered in long, reddish-brown hair from head to foot, and he was naked. His hand was bare on the palm and kind of dark gray colored like his face, but his eyes were black as coal, no whites that I could see. I knew what he wanted, and I slowly opened my pack and handed him one of my sandwiches. We sat there eating together, and I tried talking to him, asking him his name and stuff like that. I was just a kid, what did I know? He just grunted at me a few times and shrugged his massive shoulders, but always watched me with those black eyes under the long hair on his head, which was kind of round but had a peak in the back. After he ate the meal, he just stood up and walked away into the cedar trees and was gone. I quickly grabbed my stuff and ran down the hill to my cabin, and I told my mom and dad what had just happened. They just laughed at me and said not to tell anyone about it because people would think I was crazy and lock me up. Well, I didn't know it then, but he had to have been following me around those hills and back to my cabin because he would come to my window at night, the only one that didn't have a light on the side of the house, and he would tap on my window. Again, I always thought it was some guy who wanted food, so I made it a habit to give him things like apples and grapes and watermelon. How many times he came to my window over the years, I can't even guess, but it was a lot. After the movie Boggy Creek, I went out into the hills less and less, but he was coming to me, so it didn't matter much. We moved from the lake cabin in 1979 or 80, but had to go back from time to time until we all had our things out and we sold the place. I sure miss the place now. I still go back sometimes when I can. I always keep looking into the woods. Before the cabin sold, my girlfriend and another couple went back for the weekend to get the last of my stuff. I went over to a friend's house to let him know we were there, and on the way back, as I walked along, I heard my girlfriend screaming bloody murder, so I took off at a dead run as fast as I could. And when I got to the cabin, I found all three of them standing in the middle of the living room with knives all huddled together. Now that's funny, but I know it must have scared the crud out of them all when Edgar came to me and looked in the windows. My male friend talked to me then and told me that something huge that walked upright had been looking in the windows. He was a big guy and he was shaking pretty bad. It has been a few years now, and even though some things I do forget, those I can never forget even if I wanted to. Also, before we moved, my friends and I saw him and it scared them so bad they would not camp out anymore. Since then, I have checked the BFRO website for any reports in that area, and guess what? There are a few. Now, I live on a lake downstream, and guess what? More reports here too. So is he wandering, or are there more? I'm not going to say they are friendly fellows, but I think this one was young, about my age at the time, and he knew that I was no threat. But still he stood about 7 feet or so, and when he moves, there's little to no sound. All right, Robert, thank you very much for sending me that story, and you say your health's failing. I certainly hope you get better soon, buddy. All right, thanks. This encounter is sent by Matt, and the encounter happens in Oregon. It's a bow hunting story. I love these. I like to bow hunt, and these are great. But I'm not a real avid bow hunter, but these guys that really do it, they're crazy. They're like madmen in the woods. And in Oregon, the bow season begins the first week of September. This is usually the time of year with some of our best weather. Well, best if you're not bow hunting. This year was warm, but we were happy because it had been a rather rainy, wet summer, and there were not the usual ban on campfires. We were hoping this would allow us to get to the areas we were going to hunt without making much noise. This year, I was taking my nephew and his friend with me for opening weekend. They were both going into their senior year of high school and had to be back home by late Sunday night. We left Portland and set up camp Friday night a few miles south of Timothy Lake in the Mount Hood National Forest. We were all tired and overslept, but I assured them that the best hunting in this area was in the evening so that they didn't have to worry about it. Our camp was on the bank of a dry stream. I walked them down this dry stream, first dropping off the friend at a huge game trail crossing the area, while my nephew and I continued following the dry stream. My nephew and I walked about a mile further and found an underground spring that was feeding a very large section, and we could see tons of tracks all around the pools that had formed. Behind us there was a clear-cut area about 200 feet wide and dense forest behind that. I remember thinking that it was unusually quiet. Nothing was moving or making any noise except the slight breeze that was coming from the east. From behind us, just inside the tree line, past the clear cut, there was a very loud crack of a branch breaking that was followed by the dead thud hitting the ground. This made both my nephew and I turn and look in that direction. For a few minutes we could hear some small twigs break, and I could tell something was moving just inside that tree line. And then I saw it. It was a very large dark brown shadow that moved from one tree to another and looked as if it had just reached up a little higher than its head as it moved, and the instant sound of another large branch breaking and hitting the ground broke the quiet. This is a forest of Douglas fir trees, and there are very few branches below the 10-foot level. I stared intently into the tree line, trying to process what I had just seen. I didn't even notice that my nephew had come over and was squatting right behind me. I jumped when he whispered, "What was that?" I whipped my head around and was about to cuss when the loudest growl that turned into a scream hit us. I mean, it hit us. It was not only amazingly loud, you could feel it as if it hit you and passed through you. Again, my nephew asked, "What was that?" I only replied, "It's time for us to go." As he and I approached camp, we could see that his friend had built what I could only describe as a castaway's signal fire. He asked if we had heard that scream and said that he had headed straight back to the camp when he heard it, and he was about a mile away from us. My nephew is now an Oregon State Trooper, and he works for the Department of Fish and Game. And to this day, if we mention that day and the sound that we will never forget, you can see the hair on our arms stand straight up as the goosebumps appear. Fast forward about 10 years, and I was hunting with my girlfriend's family in northeastern Oregon. Her grandpa, her dad, and 2 brothers. We were all sitting by the fire at night when an elk bugled, and one of her brothers said it might be a Bigfoot and laughed, making fun of me for believing in the creature. About 5 minutes later, that same growling scream that was burned into my memory came up from deep in the canyon. Grandpa said, "You know what that was, don't you, Matt?" I just replied, "Yes, sir, I do." Grandpa stood up and said, "Well, boys, now you know what a Bigfoot sounds like. I'm going to bed." After hearing that sound for the second time, something inside me changed. I felt like it screamed directly at me. I don't know how else to explain it. I have not hunted or spent much time in the woods since then. I do not fear or stress as I write this, but tears stream down my face for some reason. It's very strange to me. Matt, I've never had an encounter, and I don't know how it affects people, really, really deep down inside. But brother, I know that this changed your life. I hear that over and over, that these encounters will change people and the way they look at the world. That was really well written, and I appreciate you taking the time to send it. Thanks to all of the folks who take the time to write these down and send them in. You're sharing some really good information with people out there who may or may not send in an encounter. It doesn't matter, but you're validating something they may have seen or experienced. And you're really doing a good service, so I appreciate it. Okay, that's going to do it for this video, and I appreciate you listening, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you.